It's nice to be here, and I thank Donald for inviting me, going back to July last year. And my first reaction was to say to my wife, Donald has invited me to speak at Perspectives. I don't like to say no to an invitation like that. But I'm a bit worried because I could go on for hours about my work. But I don't know what I might have to say about the growth of my faith and spirituality. So, as usual, my wife came up with a very sensible response to that. She said, well, don't prepare too early, just wait on, you might have a Damascus Road experience. So we'll see if that happens. My early life, I was born in Birmingham in 1947. And my mother was a Brony. She was one of 8 children. And my father was a Liverpudlian Scout. They met in the forces during the war. And my father had a background in the Roman Catholic Church, which he effectively gave up because my mother's family were violently against that sort of thing. Anyway, the only connection we had with church life during my younger years was that we used to have fish on Fridays. That was my mother condescending to my father's wishes. My first contact with church came through joining the youth club at Longbridge Methodist Church in Birmingham. You'll all have heard of Longbridge, I'm sure. And I was invited there by a number of school friends of mine. And it was great fun. I played for the football team and all that sort of thing. And our meetings on Fridays always ended by a chap by the name of, which couldn't be forgotten, of course, Derek Groves. He was an amazing character, really, because he would sit with his pipe for the whole evening indoors in the days when people smoked pipes quite a lot. And I don't think I ever saw him without his pipe. So when he was at our youth club meetings, he would be there with his pipe, and he always ended up with an epilogue, which included an invitation to come to church on Sunday. And most people sort of treated that with some hilarity. I must have done myself at some stage. Eventually, I decided to accept the invitation. And I was about 16, 17 at the time. Don't think I've really looked back since then. And sadly though, the story ended up quite sadly, because Derek, who was a very committed man and a devoted man, a couple of years later, he left the church and he lost his faith. Because the minister's wife was a member of the charismatic movement, and she told him that he couldn't be much of a Christian if he wasn't prepared to stand up and wave his hands in the air. And that taught me an early lesson in growing in faith. That to expect other people to be comfortable doing all the same things that you do, you shouldn't really do it. And I've tried to remember that all my life. When I've been to these meetings before, I know people have spent a little while telling the audience when they became a Christian and how they became a Christian. I find that a difficult one to answer. I can't put a date on it. But I do remember at the church in Hexham, before we came to worship at the Abbey, a man seemed to take great delight in reminding me or telling me that he didn't think I was a Christian. And I sort of laughed it off. But secondly, I thought, I wonder what his definition would be of a Christian. Because this man, I used to pick him up and take him to church every Sunday morning. And when he wasn't able to come to church, every week I took him the notice sheet, and his first question would be about what the sermon was about. So I'd spent ages trying to remember what happened at the sermon, and we talked about it. And every time I mentioned the fact that I wasn't really sure about a particular aspect of what was said, he would come out with his old saying, well, you can't be a proper Christian if you don't believe that. And I felt like saying to him, do you think that's more important than the fact that I come here every week to visit a grumpy old man like you? And so, at a house group meeting at the same church, one lady said that she admired me because I wasn't very religious. And I think that it was meant to be a form of a compliment. At least I hope it was. And I agreed with her, actually. Sorry about that. Now, how many of you would like me to start again? The other thing that was said once at a church council meeting, when the whole discussion about how can we attract more people to church, one person said to me, well, pointing at me, he said, well, he puts people off coming to church because he wears a jacket and tie every Sunday morning. And I thought, this is appalling, isn't it? People try and come up with all sorts of excuses why people don't come to church. And they pick the simple things like, we need more guitars, or we need to take all the pews out, and they think people will rush into the church when you do that. I never believe that to be true. And the other thing that people find difficult with me, I think, is that I have quite an unusual view on prayer. I think that in church in particular, we spend a lot of time trying to tell God about things that he ought to pay his attention to, without thinking that perhaps he might know about them already. And a lot of our prayers are focused, to me it seems, on trying to change God's priorities so that they fit in with our views. I can't go along with that, and I have to think of a different form of wording when we have prayers in church. I can deal with it at home, but that's some of you may feel the same. Anyway, when I look back over my life, I can actually see definite occasions when God has helped me through a situation. But what I can't remember is praying about that situation before it happened. And would you believe it? God seemed to know what was right for me, even without me asking him. And I believe that to be a truth. Anyway, so I'll start with my education now, which is probably one of the reasons why I'm here. I did a degree in chemistry at Birmingham University. And because I got a relatively good degree, I was invited immediately to join the polymer research group at the chemistry department in Birmingham to do a PhD. And the project I was involved in was sponsored and supported by the Ministry of Defence. And would you believe it, it was specifically sponsored by their rocket science department. Now the best way for me to explain the project I was involved in is to refer you to consideration of the Challenger disaster in 1986. This disaster was caused by leakage from the fuel storage tanks, caused by a breakdown in the O-rings that separated out the sections of the tanks. These O-rings are rubber materials, and it was known already at the time but some of the rubber can tend to become brittle, lose its elasticity and become brittle at low temperatures. And the disaster was caused by the fact that the weather for days and days before the takeoff, which was in January, had caused the O-ring rubber to become brittle and crack. And the rocket fuel had leaked and caused the explosion which killed 7 of the crew members. So my project was to try to develop a rubber which could be used as an O-ring that wouldn't become brittle and crack at low temperatures. So some of you here will know what's meant by the term glass transition temperature. The idea was to make a rubber with a lower glass transition temperature. And that was my PhD project, working in rocket science. The project, from my point of view, was successful, but only on a miniature scale. And it took years and years and years after that to develop it up into a higher scale so that it could be used in the rocket development. So unfortunately, my research wasn't applied to real rockets until too late to save the crew members. But it was an interesting experience, and it led me into the next stage of development in my work, which was thinking about materials that I used in other hazardous environments, such as in the body or in the mouth. And that's when I became involved first in working in dental materials, again down at Birmingham originally, and began to do a lot of work that was published, and started getting the occasional invitation to go and speak abroad. But the big change in my life came in 1977, when Newcastle University announced the future opening of a brand new medical and dental school, and they advertised for a post of a lecturer in dental material science, which I applied for and got. Actually, there's a member of the interviewing panel for that. I think he's regretted it ever since. These two gentlemen here are previous deans of our faculty, by the way, John Murray and Robin Seymour. So I got that job. One of the things that I had my leg pulled about initially was that in this unit, which was set up marvellously for doing materials research with equipment and etc., but I had the biggest office in the dental faculty, even bigger than the dean's office, and that caused a lot of hilarity, as you can imagine. So I built up a research team working on materials used mainly in dentistry, but sometimes in medicine as well. And at the same time, I started writing a book, a textbook for undergraduates, called Applied Dental Materials. And it became quite successful. It was translated into 7 languages and ran for 9 editions. And as a result of this being used in universities throughout the world, I suppose I became reasonably well known, and I got lots of people writing to me asking if they could come and do research with me in my laboratories in Newcastle. And I developed lots of connections. I was invited to lots of different countries to give talks. And the country I developed a particularly strong connection with was Japan. I've been there lots and lots of times. And in Japan, they now have something called the JFM Club, That's my initials. And all the members, there are 17 of them, are all people who've been to work with me in Newcastle. And they have meetings quite regularly. I'm quite put out because they even have meetings when I'm not there. And so that was great, meeting all these people from overseas. During this time, I was still committed to an active church life. I was a steward and senior steward and circuit steward for a while in the Methodist Church. But probably my main occupation was flower arranging. My wife ran a club called Cameo, Come and Meet Each Other. And a group of us drove around in cars on a Thursday to pick up people from their houses and bring them in for afternoon tea. On each table would have a nice flower arrangement, and that was my responsibility. People reckoned that I had a natural inclination towards doing it, and I said, well, don't tell anybody. So, when students from overseas started coming quite regularly to Newcastle, there were always two invitations made to them. One was for them to be invited to come to church with me and my family on a Sunday morning. Now that's not as easy as it might sound, because there were lots of Muslims, Shintos, Buddhists. So the big selling factor, of course, was that when they were invited out, they would also come for Sunday lunch, which was possibly the main reason why they came. I don't know. But anyway, I took virtually all of the visitors, and there were large numbers of them, to church. And the second invitation was to come to at least one football match at St James's Park. And that was in the days when you could get tickets. And as a result, it became expected when I went to visit Japan that the sort of gift that they would like from me would be a replica shirt of some sort. So you see all these people now walking around Japan wearing black and white striped shirts. And because all these people from different countries became aware of my beliefs, quite often when I went to visit them abroad, I would be invited to attend church on a Sunday morning, which was nice. My group, with all these researchers, most of whom were working towards either masters or PhDs, it was involved with the development of new and better materials, but also in the assessment of materials for their clinical use, without having to use real guinea pigs, if you like, to test potentially dodgy materials without really thoroughly testing them beforehand. So I developed a series of tests with the co-workers for assessing materials and predicting how they might perform clinically. And through that, I became quite heavily involved in ISO standards. So I've written quite a lot of the ISO standards for dental materials that are now used throughout the world. And along with the visiting co-workers that came with me, we were pleased to be able to do that and maintain the standard of safety. For example, if a material contains a potentially dodgy ingredient, you want to find out that it's not leaching out into the mouth. So that sort of test. Or if a material could cause damage by fracturing, you want to make sure it's strong enough. That sort of thing. And actually, when I retired in 2011, I was actually in Rio de Janeiro At the university, in addition to my own research and academic teaching and so on, I was also involved in some administrative duties along with my two colleagues here. So, for example, I was for a long time on the executive for our department, or sub-faculty. And the executive was comprised of 3 professors. The dean, which could have been either John or Robin, and myself, I was always responsible for teaching activities and examinations, and another professor who was responsible for running the research committee. And one thing that I will always remember is the time when a student came to see me the week before an exam and said, with his arm in a sling, and he said he wouldn't be able to sit the exam. So I told him not to worry. There's ways and means of dealing with this. I said, I'll book a room, and myself and 2 other professors will sit and ask you questions for about an hour. That should work out well, because we'll be able to cover a lot more material than we would do in the written exam that you can't take. So I could see this lad's arm beginning to twitch. Already. And he said, oh, he'd give some second thoughts as to whether he could do the exam. And he actually emailed me within minutes after the meeting and said, he's decided he'll do the exam. So the word got round that there had been a miracle in the dental school. And apparently, people of high status in the university were inquiring as to whether they should write to the Pope about it. At that time, a lot of my colleagues started calling me St. John, or St. John for short, and they still do call me St. John. I mean, you know, talking 30 years on from that, a lot of my colleagues call me St. John because of it. A short while ago, you may recall, here in the Abbey, that we had a festival of Northern Saints. And I said to David Glover, I said, would I qualify for that? And he said, well, we've only got room for 48. He said, the last 2 came down sort of between you and Cuthbert. He said, sadly, Cuthbert won on account tax. Yeah. But I don't claim to have any real saintly characteristics, but I think I know a few people who do, and people who probably don't realise that they do. For example, the chap I talked about at the beginning, Derek, who really encouraged me into the church, and then was treated very badly, and he sort of almost lost his own faith. It's almost like a sort of martyrdom, really. He did a lot to encourage people into the church, and then he had his own faith shattered. And about 2 years ago, I had a hip replacement. And one of the worst things about that was I couldn't go to the football for about 6 months. And I will always remember my first day back at the football after my hip replacement. They had changed. I normally park down Richardson Road, which is near where the dental hospital is. When I went to park the car, they changed the system insofar as the machines where you could put money in were no longer operating. And there were signs on all of them saying, use a different machine, but the next one wasn't working either. So I didn't know what to do, so this couple pulled up behind me, and they sort of jumped out and went walking off, and I stopped them. And said, have you paid for the car park? They said, oh yeah. I said, well, how did you do that? They said, well, online. And they pointed to a sign wasn't here last time I came. They said, oh no, that's fine. We'll show you how to download the app onto my phone. So they tried, and I kid you not, we were there for about half an hour. Ended up about 10 minutes or so before the kick-off. And they said, don't worry, I think we can put you on our scheme. So you can have as many different cars as you like on the scheme. And they said, we can pay for your car. And it was £8. And I said, oh, that's so kind, I'll try and get that app downloaded later. I said, how much do I owe you? They said, nothing. It's your first day back, we can see you're struggling. Just think of it as our treat. And I thought, well, that's really lovely. First day back. Went to the match. And I'd been sitting next to the same group of people for 20 odd years. And the two blokes either side of me were slightly younger than I was. And at the end of the match, I thought, I'm going to wait now until everybody's gone and then it's safe for me to walk down the steps. And without saying anything, I was aware of the fact that these two chaps next to me were still there. And the ground was virtually completely empty, and they said, come on then, we should be all right now. And they both helped me down the steps. I said, that's so kind. And do you know what? That went on for weeks and weeks. And I went back home and I thought, I've had a marvellous experience today. There's these two lovely people that sorted me out with the car park, and the two chaps at the football ground helping me down the steps. And I said, that just can't be a coincidence. I think, this is one of those times when I can think that, I know it's only a small thing, but God was involved in that, I'm sure. And what it did to me was, it made me think, if I'm ever in a position where I can do something to help somebody, I'm going to do it, there's no doubt about that. And I really feel that God's love is spread among us all by little simple acts of kindness like that. And if we could do that a bit more often, I think we would be living in a much nicer world. Another lesson from St James's Park, which I laugh about and refer back to, I now talk about it as being the parable of the unused season ticket. Because in the row of seats along from me, it was a time when Bobby Robson was manager, and the ground was always full, as it is now, at that time. And one season, it must have been about 2002, I think, because it was not long after I had become a season ticket holder. We noticed that one seat in August was empty, and it stayed empty. Everywhere else was jam-packed full. And none of us could work out why, until on Boxing Day. This chap turned up and sat in the seat. We said, well, where have you been? He said, my wife bought me this season ticket back in August, but she wanted to save it as a Christmas present. So it just shows, you don't really realise how good something is until you actually use it. When I talk to all my overseas people, visitors and so on, about my faith, I feel it's somewhat inappropriate in some ways to try and drum into them the fact that their only way to salvation is if they believe all the same things that I believe in. That can be counterproductive. So I focus on telling them that I do believe that God's love binds us all together in ways that some of us don't really understand. And whenever we have little meetings of people from different parts of the world, it's become traditional now that I give a short speech before the meal. And instead of it being a traditional grace, I focus on how important it is for all of us from different parts of the world to care and support each other, care for and support each other, and how much better the world would be if that was adopted worldwide. And that's my belief. And I want to finish by telling you the satisfaction I've received from joining Rotary since I retired. Now that you'll see the reason why I'm telling you this story in a minute or two when I come to the last line. But one funny thing is my Japanese friend said, "You're in Rotary?" In Japan, you'd have to be a multi-millionaire to be invited to become a member of Rotary. They're all big tycoons, and they couldn't believe that I was allowed to be a member of Rotary. But the thing I like about Rotary is the main slogan, service before self. Now, most people, if you ask them to join any sort of organisation now, I think their first thought might be, well, what's in it for me? But in Rotary, service before self, I think, is a challenging motto to take on. And since 1985, the main international work of Rotary has been in trying to eliminate the awful disease of polio from the world. Since 1985, Rotary has raised over $2 billion towards trying to erase polio. It's provided vaccines to millions of children in over 100 different countries. And over that time, the number of cases of polio has dropped from an annual case of new infections being about 300,000 per year down to 20 over the last few years. And it's a pity we can't nail the last 20, but there are reasons for that which I can't go into just now. But the slogans that Rotary uses, end polio now, and something called purple for polio. Now that relates to the fact that the national symbol that's used is the purple crocus plant. And the fact that when children are given the vaccine, they put their finger onto a pad of purple-coloured ink, and that shows that they've had the vaccine, so they don't come back tomorrow and have another one. So that's where purple for polio comes. And one of the things that that Rotary does, it sells purple-coloured crocus corn, and also lapel badges, which are made from a silk in the shape of a crocus. And several years ago, I planted about 200 crocus corns in my front garden, in the lawn. So they came up in the springtime, and they looked quite magnificent. And I started putting a collection box out there with a notice saying what it was all about. And some of these crocus lapel badges, and a box full of money. And I didn't collect much money, to be honest. It wasn't, the main purpose was to try and bring attention to it. But I got the shock of my life one day. I was looking out, and the box was there, and the crocuses were in full bloom. And the dustbin lorry came down the road. And one of the men from the dustbin, he came over and looked at it and read the word. And he called his two friends, the driver and the other man. And they both stood there, and these three dustbin men, they actually donated more than the rest of the people altogether that had made the donation. sermon in itself. I mean, I thought I was going into this to try and teach people something, and I ended up by being taught myself. How often does that happen? So, I think that's probably a good place in which to finish. Sorry about the mess up at the beginning with the microphone, but food for thought anyway.
Thank you.